Yesterday, a series of global trade figures landed on my desk that should make everyone in Ottawa and Washington stop what they are doing. It is a data set that outlines the most consequential economic miscalculation in a generation. On the surface, the story of global trade is usually told through dry press releases and bureaucratic handshakes. But if you look beneath the noise, at the actual movement of heavy industrial commodities, you find the real scoreboard of geopolitical power. Right now, that scoreboard shows that a policy designed to bring America's neighbour to its knees has instead triggered a structural realignment that cannot be undone. When Donald Trump stood before cameras and announced a massive 50% tariff on Canadian primary aluminium, the official narrative out of Washington was simple, punchy, and designed for domestic consumption. The White House claimed it would protect hollowed-out American industries, punish Canada for daring to defend its own sectors, and force manufacturing jobs back to the American Midwest. The tariff took effect in June 2025. The administration assumed Canada had no choice but to capitulate, absorb the pain, and sell its metal at a steep discount to desperate US buyers. The strategy worked, just not the way anyone in Washington intended. Canada's primary aluminium did not vanish from the global market, nor did Canadian producers beg for mercy. Instead, they executed a supply chain pivot so swift and aggressive it caught Western trade regulators completely off guard. By the hundreds of thousands of tons, Canadian green aluminium bypassed the United States entirely and headed across the Atlantic today. In the middle of a brutal conflict in the Middle East that has knocked out regional smelters and choked off critical shipping lanes, Europe finds itself sitting on one of the most valuable industrial lifelines in the world. Meanwhile, American factories are trapped in a severe supply crisis, forced to pay catastrophic record-high premiums just to keep their assembly lines moving. This is not a random twist of fate. This is the story of how a single protectionist wall handed Europe an industrial jackpot, left American manufacturers exposed, and locked the United States into a structural deficit it is fundamentally unequipped to solve. To understand how this happened, you have to look at what Canada actually represents on the global chessboard. Canada is not just a participant in the metals market. It is the fourth largest primary aluminium producer on the planet, trailing only China, India, and Russia. The country pumps out roughly 3.3 million tons of primary metal every single year. Crucially, 9 of its 10 primary smelters sit inside a single province, Quebec. Quebec's dominance is not an accident of geography. It is the result of a deliberate, decades-long strategic bet. The province owns Hydro-Québec, a massive, state-controlled hydroelectric network that generates an absolute abundance of renewable energy. Because of this grid, Quebec provides electricity to industrial smelters at rates up to 3 times lower than what American commercial customers must pay. In the aluminium business, electricity is not just an overhead expense, it is the primary input cost. The entire competitive advantage of Canadian aluminium can be condensed into a single sentence. It is powered by massive rivers, and the energy costs almost nothing. Consider the scale. The Alouette smelter in Sept Isles alone possesses a production capacity of 632,000 tonnes per year. That single facility produces more primary aluminium than the total output of every active smelter in the United States combined. Alcoa operates 3 massive facilities across the province at Baie-Comeau, Deschambault and Bécancour, while Rio Tinto anchors the industrial heartland of the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region. In 2024, Canada exported nearly 2.6 million tonnes of unwrought aluminium. Depending on the month, between 70% and 85% of that massive volume went to exactly one customer, the United States. That was the old baseline. It was stable, deeply integrated and economically logical. Canada generated the raw metal using clean, cheap power, and America's massive manufacturing engine consumed it. It was an arrangement that kept North American supply chains globally competitive for decades. Then, Washington hit it with a sledgehammer. Here is the timeline to keep things clear. In March 2025, the US administration reimposed a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminium, claiming national security grounds. Ottawa did not back down. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney retaliated immediately, slapping 29.8 billion Canadian dollars, roughly $20.7 billion US dollars, in counter tariffs on American goods. Simultaneously, Ontario retaliated by placing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports flowing directly to US border states. Angered by the defiance, Trump escalated the conflict, declaring a national emergency and threatening to double the wall. In June 2025, he followed through. Canadian aluminium was hit with an unprecedented 50% tariff. Effective immediately, the calculus inside the White House assumed that Canadian metal had nowhere else to go. But the international trade architecture is dynamic, not static. What followed was a supply chain redirection that moved faster than anyone in Washington anticipated. During a subsequent earnings call, Alcoa's leadership disclosed that the company had already diverted more than 100,000 tons of Canadian aluminium away from traditional US buyers to alternative international clients. The reason was purely financial. The 50% tariff destroyed the netback, the actual profit producer's pocket after factoring in logistics, freight, and duties. Europe was offering far better net returns, so the metal sailed east. The pivot at the Alouette smelter tells the story in stark numbers. The facility, which is 40% owned by Rio Tinto, saw its shipments to Europe skyrocket to 57% of its total output in the second quarter of 2025, up from a meager 4% in the first quarter. Think about that massive shift. In less than 90 days, a mega smelter that historically fed the American industrial heartland flipped more than half its export volume to the European continent. Executive leadership at Rio Tinto's aluminium division stated transparently that they redirected production to Europe to maximize asset value in a distorted commercial environment. Hard macro data confirmed this was an industry-wide stampede. Canada's aluminium exports to the European Union, which hovered near zero in early 2024, surged to comprise between 6% and 40% of monthly export totals throughout the remainder of 2025. In April and May of 2025 alone, countries like the Netherlands absorbed 11,800 tonnes of Canadian primary metal, while Italy took in 25,500 tonnes, markets that previously recorded almost no Canadian imports. Consequently, Quebec's share of exports bound for the US dropped from 95% to 78% in a matter of months. Even before geopolitical stability shattered, Canadian shipments to Europe had already expanded by 276%, exceeding 590,000 tonnes, secured to this channel for clear, fact-driven analysis of how these hidden economic shifts affect our national sovereignty. If you want to see the full picture beyond the daily headlines, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button right now. The real crisis ignited on February 28, 2026, when conflict broke out in the Middle East, transforming a localized trade dispute into a structural global emergency. The Middle East represents roughly 9% of global primary aluminium capacity, but because local industrial consumption is minimal, virtually all of it is exported to global markets via the Strait of Hormuz. When military strikes broke out, the strait effectively locked down. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard declared the passage a no-go zone, leaving more than 150 commercial vessels stranded outside the bottleneck. The global supply shock was instantaneous. Aluminium Bahrain, which runs the world's largest single-site smelter at 1.6 million tonnes per year, saw its operations curtailed by 19% due to immediate logistics failures and subsequent direct strikes on its infrastructure. In late March, Emirates Global Aluminium's Al Tawala facility in Abu Dhabi suffered severe missile damage, with management warning that restoring full capacity could take up to a year. Commodity analysts at major financial institutions like ING quickly recalculated the math. The sudden idling of Middle Eastern capacity yanked roughly 3 million tonnes of aluminium offline, leaving a massive global supply deficit of up to 2.5 million tonnes. Industry research groups warned that historic low inventory levels would send prices spiralling toward $4,000 per tonne. London Metal Exchange futures surged past $3,450 per tonne in March 2026 alone, a lightning-fast 10% jump in a few weeks, while European premiums on industrial aluminum spiked by 16%. Bank of America analysts laid out the brutal structural reality for the year. Europe is facing a massive 5.6 million tonne aluminium deficit. The United States faces its own domestic deficit of 3.8 million tonnes. But Europe's gap is the largest. and it comes on top of losing Russian supplies due to the Ukraine war and the mothballing of South 32's Mosel smelter in Mozambique. 3 independent supply pillars collapsed in less than 3 years. Faced with an industrial freeze, Europe looked across the Atlantic and grabbed the one major supply source that had just been freed up by American tariff policy. The 50% tariff did not cause the Middle Eastern war, but it ensured that when the world ran out of metal, Canada's vast production capacity was already unlocked, repackaged, and flowing directly into the hands of European buyers. The traditional, exclusive partnership between Canada and the United States was broken, and Europe was more than happy to collect the pieces. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. That unanswered question centers on how the United States, a nation requiring nearly 5 million tons of imported aluminium annually to sustain its automotive, aerospace, and defense sectors, intends to rebuild its industrial base when its primary supplier has fundamentally restructured its business model. To understand why this supply chain shift is permanent, we must look beyond the immediate trade numbers and conduct a deep dive into the underlying deal architecture, the legal framework of European trade policy, and the stark financial realities governing industrial smelting. The modern trade environment does not operate on goodwill. It operates on locked-in structural advantages, binding corporate contracts, and regulatory penalties that are rewriting the global balance of economic power. To fully dissect the mechanics of this shift, we must break the strategic architecture down into 3 core pillars that explain why Canadian metal is not coming back to the American market anytime soon. First, consider the structural decay of domestic American smelting capacity. The United States has dwindled to just 4 primary aluminium smelters left operating on its soil. Together, these remaining facilities possess a maximum theoretical output of 1.36 million tons per year. However, due to aging infrastructure and uncompetitive operating conditions, the US produced only around 680,000 tons of primary metal, operating at a meager 50% capacity. This left an enormous domestic supply gap of over 4.8 million tons that must be filled by foreign imports. For decades, Canada filled more than half of that shortfall, sending 2.6 million tons across the border. The White House operated under the assumption that a 50% tariff wall would act as an economic shield, forcing domestic producers to restart their idled pots and incentivize the construction of brand new state-of-the-art smelting infrastructure inside the United States. But that assumption ignored the basic economics of metallurgy. According to data published by the Aluminium Association, even if every single idled US smelter magically came back online overnight, the combined output would cover barely 15% of the nation's current 4 million metric ton structural supply gap. Building a new smelter from scratch is an agonizingly slow and financially punitive endeavor. Currently, only 1 new primary smelter is under development in the United States, located in Oklahoma. This project represents only the 2nd primary smelter built on American soil in the last 45 years. It is not projected to be operational until 2030 at the absolute earliest, and as of mid-2026, its long-term industrial electricity supply contract has not even been finalized. This brings us to the 2nd pillar of the deal architecture: the permanent, unfixable disparity in input costs between the 2 nations. Smelting aluminium is, at its core, a process of turning electricity into solid metal. The reason new facilities are not being built in the United States is not a matter of red tape or regulatory overreach. It is the prohibitive cost of American commercial power. US industrial electricity rates are structurally 32% higher than Canada's hydro-powered baseload. Compounding this pressure, US industrial labour costs are 31% higher than those found in Quebec's established smelting hubs. The consequences of this math were visible long before the tariff war began. Century Aluminium was forced to mothball its Hawesville, Kentucky smelter specifically because surging domestic energy prices stripped the facility of any economic viability. When Washington imposed the 50% tariff, it did not lower American energy costs. It simply forced domestic manufacturers to absorb the cost of a massive surcharge known as the Midwest Premium. The Midwest Premium, the localized fee added on top of the base London Metal Exchange price to cover domestic delivery and regional scarcity, serves as the ultimate mathematical proof of this policy failure. Before the trade war, the premium sat at manageable, predictable levels. After the initial 25% tariff in March 2025, it spiked violently. Following the 50% escalation in June, it tore into record territory, hitting an unprecedented $1,950 per tonne by November 2025. By February 2026, the premium smashed through the psychological barrier of $2,182 per tonne, marking the first time in global trading history that American buyers paid more than $1 per pound just for the premium alone. This means American downstream manufacturers, Company, manufacturing beverage cans, machined automotive components, structural building products, and aerospace hulls are stuck paying an all-in price exceeding $5,340 per tonne. Between February and May of 2025, US aluminum prices surged 139% faster than European prices. The Canadian C.D. Howe Institute summarised the reality in a blunt diagnostic. Canadian aluminium cannot be rapidly substituted. US importers must either continue buying from Canada while eating the tariff costs or downsize their own industrial production. The United States lacks the productive capacity to ramp up quickly, and it lacks alternative trading partners capable of filling a multi-million-tonne void. Third, and perhaps most critically, is the regulatory architecture implemented by the European Union that permanently locks Canadian metal into the European orbit. On January 1, 2026, Europe's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, known globally as a CBAM, entered its definitive, legally binding phase. CBAM is not a standard tariff. It is a sophisticated carbon border tax designed to equalise the price of carbon emissions between domestic European production and imported goods. Under this framework, every single tonne of aluminium entering the European Union from an external border faces a financial penalty calibrated directly to the carbon intensity of the energy grid that produced it. This is where the long-term trade diversion turns into a net geopolitical realignment. High-carbon primary metal exported by China, India, or other coal-dependent jurisdictions faces devastating financial penalties under CBAM, effectively pricing them out of the European industrial market. Conversely, Quebec's primary smelters operate on an electricity grid that is nearly 100% renewable hydropower. Consequently, Canadian primary metal boasts the lowest carbon footprint of any major aluminium-producing region on Earth. Under CBAM regulations, Canadian green aluminium enters the European market facing essentially zero carbon tax liabilities. This regulatory alignment creates an immense, permanent commercial advantage. European industrial buyers are not purchasing Canadian metal out of geopolitical sympathy. They are doing so because the combination of high regional scarcity, disrupted Middle Eastern supplies, and zero CBAM exposure makes Canadian aluminium the most financially logical choice on the planet. Furthermore, the joint venture between Alcoa and Rio Tinto, the ELYSIS technology project headquartered in Quebec, is actively commercializing a revolutionary smelting process that replaces traditional carbon anodes with inert materials, emitting pure oxygen as a byproduct rather than carbon dioxide. Canada did not just stumble into an export boom through blind luck. The nation spent decades building a structurally superior, low-emissions industrial product tailored exactly for the regulatory reality that Europe has now deployed. The trade agreements forged between Canadian producers and European industrial conglomerates throughout 2025 and early 2026 are not short-term spot market transactions. They are structured as long-term, multi-year supply commitments. Supply chains of this magnitude possess immense structural inertia. Shipping lanes have been mapped. Deep-water port logistics in places like Septiles and Rotterdam have been optimised. And corporate balance sheets have been aligned to this new transatlantic corridor. The 50% tariff, weaponised by the White House to lock Canada into an asymmetrical North American trade box, instead functioned as an economic catalyst. It broke the historical inertia of Canada's total dependence on the US market, forced domestic producers to diversify their client base, and permanently cemented Canada as the foundational supplier of green industrial metals to the European continent. It left American manufacturers isolated, starved of affordable raw materials, and competing in a hyperinflated global market against European rivals who are now backed by a reliable supply of Canadian hydro-powered metal. The hard numbers bounding this crisis outline an undeniable reality. Canada continues to produce its 3.3 million tonnes of primary metal. Europe faces a massive 5.6 million tonne deficit this year. The Middle East has seen up to 3 million tonnes of annual capacity severed by regional conflict, and the American domestic shortfall sits immovably at 3.8 million tonnes. This is the structural trap into which Western trade policy has marched. The immediate market disruptions triggered by the war in the Middle East will eventually pass. The shipping containers will eventually clear the Strait of Hormuz, and damaged Gulf smelters will rebuild their infrastructure. But the underlying architecture of global trade has been fundamentally altered, exposing a deeper vulnerability within the Western alliance that goes far beyond the price of a ton of metal. The sudden convergence of aggressive American protectionism, swift Canadian corporate maneuvering, and an unpredicted energy crisis in the Middle East has completely rewritten the geometry of global industrial trade. By treating Canada's infrastructure as an isolated political target rather than a load-bearing pillar of its own economy, Washington has successfully detached its manufacturing sector from the most reliable supply of low-carbon metal on Earth. The pre-tariff era of deep, uninhibited integration across the 49th parallel is officially over, replaced by a highly volatile, fragmented global landscape where cheap, renewable energy is the ultimate metric of sovereign power. When we look at the broader strategic implications of this shift, the primary victim is the core thesis of continental economic security. For nearly 3/4 of a century, the relationship between Canada and the United States operated on an implicit binational understanding. Canada provided secure, cheap, raw strategic materials, and the United States supplied the advanced capital and downstream consumer market. This dynamic sustained the integrated automotive assembly plants of Ontario and Michigan, the aerospace clusters of Quebec and Kansas, and the shared defence industrial base that underpins continental security networks. By applying a blunt 50% tariff instrument to primary aluminium, the White House shattered that foundational trust, forcing Ottawa to recognise that total reliance on a single, politically volatile neighbour represents an unacceptable sovereign risk. The immediate, coordinated retaliation by the Carney government, pairing tens of billions of dollars in counter-tariffs with a targeted 25% electricity export premium from Ontario, signalled that Canada is no longer willing to play the submissive junior partner in continental disputes instead. This trade war accelerated a structural diversification strategy that Canadian policymakers had discussed for generations but never fully executed. The tariff did not destroy the value of Quebec's hydro-powered metal. It merely acted as a massive kinetic force that pushed that value across the Atlantic. This brings us to the profound realignment occurring within global alliances. For Europe, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of tonnes of Canadian primary aluminium was nothing short of an industrial salvation. The European continent was already reeling from consecutive, compounding supply shocks. First, the mandatory, values-driven phasing out of Russian metal following the invasion of Ukraine, followed by structural curtailments at regional smelters plagued by exorbitant natural gas prices. When the outbreak of war in the Middle East knocked out nearly half of the Gulf Cooperation Council's smelting capacity and closed the Strait of Hormuz, Europe faced an absolute industrial collapse. Because the American tariff had already unmoored Canadian supplies from their traditional Midwestern destinations, European procurement officers were able to swoop in and absorb that volume instantly. This transaction permanently altered the trade relationship. European buyers did not merely purchase excess inventory, they signed multi-year supply contracts, optimized transatlantic shipping channels, and fully integrated Canadian low-carbon specifications into their long-term manufacturing operations. Crucially, this shift is legally locked in by Europe's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Because Canadian aluminium carries virtually zero carbon penalty under CBAM, it possesses a structural price advantage in Europe that high-emission producers in Asia or the developing world can never replicate. Even if a future US administration completely abolishes the 50% tariff tomorrow, American factories will find themselves bidding against entrenched European buyers who possess a legal, regulatory incentive to retain their grasp on Canadian clean metal. The consequences for specific strategic sectors are severe and deeply ironic. Consider the defence and advanced aerospace industries. The modern defence apparatus requires immense volumes of high-purity, aerospace-grade aluminium for everything from fighter jet hulls and missile casings to armour plating for tactical vehicles. By starving domestic markets of cheap Canadian primary metal and driving the US Midwest premium above $2,182 per tonne, Washington has artificially inflated the procurement costs of its own military-industrial complex. American defence contractors are now forced to pay an all-in price exceeding $5,340 per tonne for an essential raw material, directly undermining the White House's stated goal of rapidly rebuilding its national defence manufacturing capabilities. The energy sector has experienced an equally violent inversion of power. Historically, American states bordering Canada treated the northern frontier as a bottomless, cheap reservoir of raw energy and electricity. The moment Ontario weaponized its electricity exports by imposing a 25% tariff on power flowing south, it exposed the profound vulnerability of northern US grids that rely on Canadian baseload power to balance their own intermittent networks. It proved that in an era of climate disruption and grid instability, energy security flows from north to south, and Canada holds the physical switches. When we contrast this current crisis with the pre-2025 era, the extent of the miscalculation becomes undeniable. Before the tariff war, the North American aluminum supply chain was a highly optimized, single ecosystem machine. Canadian metal flowed seamlessly across the border, shielding American manufacturers from the extreme volatility of global energy shocks and Middle Eastern shipping bottlenecks. Today, that domestic insulation has been completely dismantled. The United States is left facing an immense 3.8 million tonne domestic deficit. Its remaining domestic smelters are choked by uncompetitive electricity rates, and its single-planned new facility in Oklahoma remains years away from operations without an established power contract. The United States has essentially trapped its own manufacturing sector in a structural vice. It cannot rapidly ramp up domestic primary production due to high commercial energy costs. It cannot source cheap metal from a war-torn Middle East, and it has successfully pushed its closest, cleanest, and most reliable neighbour directly into the arms of European competitors. This brings us to the next critical juncture in this unfolding economic conflict. As we move deeper into 2026, the entire North American trade architecture is rapidly approaching a definitive breaking point. The upcoming review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA, is no longer a routine bureaucratic evaluation. It has been transformed into a high-stakes geopolitical showdown where the very definition of continental trade will be rewritten. Ottawa is no longer entering these negotiations as a dependent satellite state, begging for exemptions. Backed by new, lucrative European trade routes, a solid CBAM-protected client base, and an absolute monopoly on low-carbon industrial metals, Canada has discovered the true leverage of its sovereign assets. The White House presented its tariff policy as an unyielding economic lever designed to force submission. But they are discovering too late that Canada's green industrial base was actually a load-bearing wall, holding up the entire roof of American manufacturing. The global scoreboard has changed, the contracts are signed, and the next move belongs entirely to Ottawa.